YouTube studio. So going live in 3, 2, and 1. Hello and welcome, everyone. This is the GraphQL Hangout. This is, in fact, the 50th edition of the GraphQL Hangout. So thank you so much for being part of this incredible journey that has lasted us almost close to 2 years now, which has been fantastic. During this period of 50 events, 50 sessions, 50 Hangouts, we've had a few different hosts, one of which has been myself. I've had the privilege to do so, but more incredibly, we've had Richard, who is with us as a co-host for the session. Thank you so much for being part of this, Richard, as well as some of the others who are not part of this today. Of course, Sedky, who's been running our America's Hangout, as well as Jens, as well as Matt, who've all been part of this incredible journey hosting these sessions. And thank you so much for getting us here. It wouldn't have been possible without your support. And during these Hangouts over the last 50 sessions, we've discussed so many different topics. There have been challenges, there have been solutions, there have been demonstrations. We've talked about security. We've spoken about some really exciting use cases. We've even spoken about GraphQL on top of the blockchain as the graph. So there's been some really, really great conversations, and there is definitely way more to go as we go into the next round of events. Today, we're going to be looking at, we thought this would be an appropriate moment, perhaps on the 50th edition, to gather all of our incredible folks here at Tyke and look at where GraphQL stands today. It's been 7 years since the launch, the official launch of GraphQL. We're coming to about 8 years now. And since then, it has seen adoption to a certain degree. It's been adopted across developers to a certain degree. They've had some really positive things that's come out of it. There have been some challenges that have come out of it. There have been organizations, at large scale organizations, who have adopted this, but there have also been challenges in terms of adopting those, whether that's security, whether that's actually understanding what the right use case for this is. So there's been positives, there have been negatives. The community at large has expanded, it has increased, it has improved, and it's going forward in a positive direction, which is incredible to see. With all of that, of course, that means that there have been some answers, there have been some solutions, but there also are some questions that remain unanswered. Primarily, the thing that excites me or interests me is that, are we actually asking the right questions of GraphQL? So maybe we'll explore some of those things today. We've got an incredible panel here. I am your host, Budha, product evangelist here at Tyke, and perhaps we'll go around the table today and do a bit of a round of introduction before we dive into today's conversation. So once again, hello and welcome, everyone. Looking forward to this session. So perhaps we'll start off with you, Richard. You're right next to me. So hello and welcome.
Hey, hey. So I'm the user researcher here at Tyke. As Budha said, I was supporting Jens in the Hangouts from the early days, and I'm here to basically learn more a bit about what the community is struggling with, what the community finds value in, and using that as insight to potentially support Agata in all our efforts to enhance our GraphQL offering. So I'll probably pass on to her with that segue.
Okay. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Agata, and I am one of the product managers here at Tyke. I usually say all things GraphQL because that kind of encompasses everything that I'm responsible for. So yeah, I have a very vested interest in those Hangouts, and I've been part of it also for the last year. Yeah, for the last year. So. Yeah.
Loads of experience getting to know the product really, really well and getting GraphQL. So a lot of questions if you're coming in. So by all means, send us your questions. There is a Q&A section right at the bottom. We've got good wishes coming our way from Phillips. Thank you, Phil. It's really, really good to have you in the audience as well. But at any point, if you in the audience want to ask us a question, definitely feel free to put that in the Q&A section, or perhaps in the chat, or just raise your hand and I'll unmute you and you can ask us live. So with that, let's move on ahead. Hello and welcome, Agatha, as well. And over to you, Ahmed.
Hello, everybody. My name is Amit. I'm head of R&D at Tyke. I've been here for about 5 years, just over 5 years now. So before we had a GraphQL offering and before I knew what GraphQL even was, helping customers, customer facing, helping customers get to grips and wrangling API management, managing their APIs from SOAP to REST to gRPC services, and now helping our customers to adopt GraphQL and in a sane way, I guess. Over to you, Zaid.
Thank you, Amit. Hey, my name is Zaid. I'm a solution architect here at Tyke. So my day-to-day is actually talking to customers or prospects about their GraphQL pain points, the problems, how we can help solve some of these problems. But I also have a developer background, and I've done a lot of GraphQL development back in the day. So got a lot of feedback for the GraphQL industry here.
Fantastic. Really good to have all of you guys here. And really, we put together this panel to look at GraphQL on a more holistic level. We're looking at research. We're looking at the technology, the research that's gone behind it. We're looking at the customer-facing challenges that have come in, the product challenges that have come in, especially for us working as well as working with some of our prospects and customers in terms of how GraphQL has been working in the wild. The Hangout itself tends to be focused on the developer side of things. So we'll try and keep the focus more on the developer's side, but there's obviously going to be bigger questions to be asked. So we'll see how the conversation flows, but we're going to keep some of those discussions focused on what the developer community today is going to be benefiting from, or perhaps has something to look forward to when it comes to GraphQL. So with that in mind, maybe opening statements, opening arguments almost to say, around the table in terms of your thoughts, where you see GraphQL is at today. Perhaps maybe a positive. It could be positive, it could be negative. Maybe we start off with that question and then we can take things forward, perhaps. Agata, would you like to kick that off in terms of where you see, what do you feel, where do you see GraphQL is today? Maybe one positive, one negative that you're hoping to accomplish or hoping to see a resolution to over the next year or so.
Okay, that's a lot of questions in one question. So let me say like that. I have been working with GraphQL not only at Tyke before as well. And we adopted, especially before Tyke, we adopted the technology. I was on a slightly different side. I was part of the development team, and I think the decision back then, it was, I think it's like almost 5 years ago now. The decision back then was made because GraphQL was cool. It was the new kid on the block, and it was like, yeah, let's do it. We just solved our problems with microservices architecture. It took us only 3 years. Let's do GraphQL now. So yeah. So that's
we are attracted to punishment sometimes, I feel.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's how it started, and we've done a lot of mistakes, and also the GraphQL was not as mature as it is right now. I feel like GraphQL Foundation actually is looking a lot into expanding the use cases that GraphQL can cover. So for me right now, we are somewhere in a place where GraphQL is no longer the buzzword, I think, at least in my perception. It's no longer like, yeah, let's jump on GraphQL. This is the new thing. REST is dead and so on. I think we are in this very peculiar place with GraphQL where we know it's good for some things. We want it to be good for some other things, and we now need to put in work to solve some of those problems. And I think the community is putting in the work. And yeah, that's generally how I feel about it. People get, there's interest, but there seems to be some barriers to adopting GraphQL in a more wider sense. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. I think we'll probably go into a little more detail with it, because I think there are the thing that I pointed out earlier on. I feel like GraphQL has been, at least in recent times, has been the victim of being asked the wrong questions almost, I feel, because for the longest period of time, it felt like the questions that we were asking of GraphQL is whether it's going to be replacing REST anytime soon. And I'm really certain that is not the question that we should be asking of GraphQL. So we'll unpack that really in a little bit of time. But before that, maybe Rich, perhaps your thoughts at the moment with some of the work that you've done around GraphQL and just speaking to looking at some of these use cases. What is your thought on the state of GraphQL today? Where do you see it doing well and perhaps lacking in some cases?
So more from the user side and learnings taken from being on these calls for over 20 so sessions, I think linking to Agata's point, that it's the barriers to adoption, I think time and time again, hearing on these calls has been the learning curve. So the learning curve, what is different to REST to the more, let's say, standard API protocols? What should I be using it for? How do I do full lifecycle GraphQL, API management, all the usual things around security? So I think there's still like that question around, from a business perspective, is it worth us investing in the upskilling of our team to adopt this new protocol? And what will the outcomes or benefits be? And I think also linking to Agata's point, what seems to be sort of happening as the technology matures, and again, as I've been hearing from some of the very knowledgeable participants in some of these sessions, the Q&As that we've run in the past, it is about focusing more on that like integration side of GraphQL and like management, and understanding if you want a basic REST API, then that's tried and tested. You know what you're getting, you know what to do with it. But if you want to do something a bit more novel with your APIs, particularly in the integration space, then that's where GraphQL potentially comes into its own. But then how you then scale that in your organization, like I said, the learning curve, it all takes a little bit of a business case and a strong POC, which a lot of people have come to us on these sessions asking around how they even do that. And I think, yeah, if that learning curve can be overcome and the specialization around the tooling of which Tyke is helping with matures, then that all starts to become very clear. And that for me is what will unlock the wider adoption.
Fair enough. Absolutely. I think we might have lost Ahmed there, but okay, we've got Zaid come. Thank you so much, Rich, for that response. Just over to you, Zaid. In terms of again thinking about GraphQL, where it stands today, there have been a lot of questions that have been asked of it. There is obviously some really good positives that have come out of it. There's a reason for its existence that was, first looked into by Facebook. There was a use case that they built this entire technology off of. But since then, do you see, speaking to customers, speaking to folks who are actually adopting this, since then, are you seeing that it is a solution where the problem is not always clear, or is it actually that people are seeing true use cases where GraphQL is the solution and you want to go that direction? Because a lot of times, sometimes people come to us and say, we want to use GraphQL. How do we make that happen? Where, that's a solution, but you don't want to do that. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum is, okay, we've got a true problem here and GraphQL is going to be the way to go to be able to solve that. So do you see a balance between them? Do you see a little bit of leaning towards one side or the other?
These are actually really good questions. What we typically see is companies typically make a decision to say, hey, we want to either be GraphQL or not GraphQL.
Right.
This is not typically the right way to go, but that's typically how I've seen it happen. GraphQL is tooling that you can use or basically for specific use cases, or not necessarily specific, but for use cases where you actually want to give the user the ability to fetch any kind of information they want from your APIs. And that's the whole point of going from REST to GraphQL. REST is more the server dictating what you get. GraphQL is allowing the end user to dictate what kind of information they want to receive. So this obviously solves a ton of problems all over the stack. But so it's funny, it's hard to answer your question because I think what really lacks in the industry right now is the knowledge of when to use GraphQL. I still believe that some companies, some engineers don't understand when to use GraphQL, when not to use GraphQL. It shouldn't be the fact that you have to decide with going with REST or GraphQL. You can go with both. It all depends on your use case, and that's the most important. Now, what I recently noticed in the industry is ever since Federation v1 was released, we started seeing that companies are now looking at GraphQL as a tool that they can use for bigger projects, for bigger graphs. And that's why Federation came about. So you're seeing that finally the GraphQL industry is moving toward, let's say, solving bigger use cases for GraphQL, where before it used to be a team or two that are using GraphQL in your company. Now we're talking about the whole company using a single graph. And that's where the new problems are coming out with Federation and all that stuff. But it's fun because, and it's great because it shows that the tooling is actually finally maturing to a point where we actually need to solve bigger use cases.
Absolutely. I think that's a very interesting look at the evolution of technology in general, right? Because you give it enough time where you would have that adoption cycle of, you might be starting off with a smaller problem, very niche, dedicated problem with maybe a smaller team involved, and then moving on to something that is scaling over a period of time. And then that scaling will have its challenges. And then as a consequence of that challenge, like you say, the tooling ecosystem is going to mature. And I think one of the direct consequence of that perhaps is Federation, because I think looking at the use case of Netflix, for instance, where they, I think, started off with no Federation and they had to manage a huge number of microservices and they were really struggling. And then after having moved to a much more in a completely federated environment, they got to a point where now it's a lot more seamless in terms of how they are scaling up their operations, how they are scaling up their application. They are a huge business. They are a huge application in there. So that's a really, really positive take on that. And there will be scaling challenges, but I think, like you say, the way the community matures and supports it perhaps is going to help us solve some of those issues. Agata, in terms of the way you're seeing the community developing today, there are obviously use cases where we want to be using GraphQL. Are there places where you would absolutely discourage people from using GraphQL as a technology? Or would you say there is potentially a use case where you could see GraphQL working across different organizations, different sizes? Or is there a particular size at which GraphQL makes more sense? Is there a particular place where GraphQL is the right choice? And in some cases, it isn't. So when to use GraphQL, when not to use GraphQL?
Yeah, so, I think for me, it's it's like REST has been with us for a long time, and it's not about technology. It's a good protocol, right? So for me, it has always been the case that if you're just starting, right? If you're, you just have one dingy API that you have to build, like, maybe it doesn't make sense. Use something that's easy. Use something that's that has a lot of tools. There's a lot of support. The libraries are actually proven time and time again. So I would say, for those maybe for those smaller projects, things that you don't anticipate to be growing in the future, I would say go for REST. I mean, yeah, GraphQL is great, and obviously I love GraphQL, and I think it's a great technology, but I think I don't want to say wasting time, but because it's not time wasted when you learn something, but I don't think I would be investing a lot of time into figuring out how to define the schema of my graph so that it's flexible and easy to navigate and so on, if I had like a really small project and I wasn't anticipating it to grow in the future. I think that's pretty much for me.
Fair enough. Ahmed, while we have you here, because I know you're having some internet trouble, I'm not sure if you're able to hear us, so yeah, I'm going to throw a question really quickly before you disappear again. So I'm just curious, from thinking about it from maybe a developer perspective as well, where we think about GraphQL adoption. Do you see people trying to extrapolate a lot of the stuff that they might have previously learned with REST and trying to just purely apply that with GraphQL, and potentially that being a challenge, especially when we think about, security, performance, the way GraphQL works. There are definite differences. There are similarities with other technologies, but there are differences. So do you see that as a potential challenge in terms of the way developers are building applications with GraphQL today?
Okay. Right. What I see, particularly, I mean, I'm looking at this through the lens of someone as a customer who might know what API gateways and API management are, right? So, and obviously that is not necessarily the state of the world or the reality. So, but I'm looking at it as though when developers adopt GraphQL, they go through the tutorials, and typically they might be front-end developers. So they're building backends for their front-end applications. And this is designed to kind of, I suppose, unify a whole bunch of microservice APIs that would be sitting in the back end that they need to be able to gain access to in the easiest way. So ultimately, GraphQL could be the ultimate front-end developer experience. The challenge is that the folks who are building these GraphQL APIs, they're not usually up to speed with the latest and greatest of API security. They can't be expected to be either. And the thing is, with GraphQL, because of this whole concept of the schema, you've got these kind of problems or these security issues. I wouldn't say they're solved because you've still got them in REST, but because REST is a whole lot more mature, we know how to deal with the problems. Whereas we kind of lost that information through, like many generations ago of software development. And I guess you can't solve them in the same way with GraphQL because of the nature of the messages in the body. You can't solve them in the same way that you do with REST. So you can't use your typical API gateways. You need to be thinking about a GraphQL aware API gateway. So I don't know if I've answered your question there, but I think I kind of have. Yep.
I do believe so.
One thing I'd add on that point is that we have seen from people who have successfully, let's say they've successfully implemented like Federation, for example, is that what they have seen in their organizations where they've tried to design schemas in the past and some of that work's been done, is that you need to then take, like you say, a more maybe software engineering type approach to how you design that schema. And it's not as straightforward as saying, okay, I've got a list of data sources which in the back end have all been surfaced. Let's just put a graph on top of that and then expose that. I think that's where I in particular become familiar with the term like domain-driven design, and saying you need to really be thinking about, okay, what is your end user trying to accomplish? How do you logically model how those, like, even within the data points at the field level, which obviously the power of GraphQL then opens up to package that together in a way that offers the end user and the graph consumer a simple and easy to use experience, and doesn't just expose them to the more intricate nature of your underlying systems in a way that maybe REST probably wouldn't be able to do, because it can't scale to the level that GraphQL enables. So I think that is also a challenge that I've seen from the community around, well, if it's one thing to have the data sources, it's another thing to like understand how you're going to package those up in a way that actually offers some value and doesn't just pass on the complexity to the end user somehow.
Absolutely. I think ultimately the choice of a technology, I think, is really governed by a few different parameters. I think maybe primarily it's around complexity versus simplicity. And somehow I think the simpler the user interface, the simpler the experience needs to be. Sometimes that's a little bit complex to actually build out. But the ultimate objective is that striking that right balance between, where you are compromising on simplicity versus the kind of benefit that you might be getting out there. So definite pros and cons there. I think there are a few different aspects as well for choice of GraphQL as a technology. There is performances that you need to consider. There is caching that you need to consider. There is error handling that you need to consider. A little bit more security that comes in as well. So maybe what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly share my screen where I'm going to draw your attention to the State of GraphQL report that was created earlier this year. And for those who are unfamiliar with it, I will share a link to this. It is readily available for everyone in the internet, so it's not a gated piece of content. And maybe there are a couple of really interesting insights that I found out of this. And this is a report that has been created by surveying 3,000 developers in the community, and they've got some really, really interesting insights. I would request you, I would recommend that you do read it at your own time. There's some really, really cool tools that it speaks of, and some really interesting insights. I'm going to draw your attention really quickly to the features section. We'll not cover everything, but there are certain interesting things. And I think, Agata, you mentioned certain things over here where you looked at some of the feature groupings, specifically around security, for instance. I think security and performance, and you found that there are things that need to be improved here. So want to shed some light on some of the findings around performance and security with this report?
Yeah, so I found it interesting because and I think we've seen it on Twitter lately, that there's a group of people that really hates GraphQL, and so they will kind of join every single discussion and start saying, oh, it's caching problems, security problems, and there's a lot of comments like that. And I kind of was surprised, especially with the security and performance, because basically what the chart is showing you is some very basic security and performance features that are available with GraphQL, and then the pretty pink bar is telling you how many respondents have used it when working with GraphQL. And I was really surprised with, for example, the low number of respondents, who are looking at query rate limiting or query depth limiting, which for me seems like very basic things you can do to make your graph a little bit more secure, and kind of it's if you do just query depth limiting, that's not really going to help you. But if you do it in conjunction with some other options, you can end up with a really secure service. And I kept thinking, because requiring authentication, as you see, it's over 63% of people have used it, which I think is because it is a very common thing. We do the same thing with REST. You have to require authentication, right? So everyone is aware of that. But I feel like a lot of people, you can hear those voices of people saying, well, GraphQL is still immature and there's a lot of problems, but you're not doing the basic things. If you're not doing, for example, query depth limiting, you've worked with GraphQL, you've exposed it to the public, and you haven't thought about query depth limiting, you're not doing the basics. So this chart was actually, I was feeling things when I was looking at it.
I mean, it's not a surprise at all, because I think yesterday I was running a session about the OWASP top 10 and looking at API security in general and what that landscape is all about. And one of the key insights that came out of it was that there is still a significant amount of organizations in the world who do not have an active or any form of API security planning at all. They do not have that strategy in place, which is an absolute shocker given the number of breaches that we have encountered. In fact, by a report I saw, I think it had increased by 681% in the last 12 months, which is incredible. And to think that there's still a third of the population, third of the organization still not having a security strategy in place. So with that, obviously, like I think we alluded to this earlier on, where we thought about, maybe people are just doing a lift and shift of what they have learned previously and trying to get up and running quickly without really going to the depths of certain things. Zaid, your take on something like this, where we think about security, performance tends to be a bit of a stickler when it comes to GraphQL, where there's a lot of questions being asked in terms of how that facade in front of the data sources is really, really working or not working. Under specific use cases, it really falls apart when we talk about, service to service communication, perhaps, where, you want to have that efficiency, not quite the wheelhouse of GraphQL, perhaps. But your thoughts on, performance as being sort of a deal breaker at this point with GraphQL?
That's a really good question. Now, performance can be detrimental a little bit to some people, and the reason for that is if you want to worry about performance, most of the time you're looking at caching as a solution because this is the easiest solution. GraphQL does not do too well when it comes to caching because of, the reasons to why. Because of the reasons to why you can't. Every query can be different. A person can ask for, or a user can ask for a lot of different fields. So yes, it's not that simple. That's where people struggle. Now, there are tools that can allow you to do caching on top of your GraphQL. For example, if the underlying resources of your graph are REST services, you can cache those REST services. So there are ways around increasing performance, but because it's not fully standardized, I believe that's where people struggle. So
right.
Once we have a clear answer to say, hey, this is how you can cache this, or there's like a standout tool that can do the caching for you and you have to set it and forget it kind of thing, that's when we'll get over that hurdle, let's say. But it's still possible. And my thinking is this: if you are a company that really cares about performance, that means that you have a lot of people accessing your APIs. You have a huge use case for it. I'm sure it would be worth the time investment at that point for you to customize your solution. So it's usually people that run into these problems are the people who are able to solve these problems because they have bigger engineering teams. They have a bigger investment in GraphQL.
At the same time, I would say, as developers, we do put a premium on performance. Definitely, when we're looking at it, we do tend to put a bit of a premium on it. But at the same time, if you really think about the reason, one of the big reasons why GraphQL also exists is to make that user experience, the developer experience, actually building out that product a lot more simpler versus what you get with something like REST, the round trip that you would have to take with REST with multiple responses, requests, versus what you would get precisely with GraphQL. So that trade-off of performance versus experience, there's always going to be that little battle. So I think it might come down to, based on your use case, what are you going to be valuing more, perhaps? And I think depending on that, you're going to be making that choice, but it may not be cut and dry, as I think people tend to do with this, where performance is not a thing here because we can't cache things and therefore it's not a solution for us. But if you're really looking at a solution at scale, maybe it's a different way of looking at it.
Well, I think you brought up a really, really good point, and I would challenge anyone who cares about performance in GraphQL to answer this question. If you have 2 or 3 separate APIs that are grouped under one graph query, that is going to be always a single graph query. While if it's REST, it's going to be multiple queries, or multiple REST calls. So if you look at the trade-off, I can argue that a single GraphQL query will always outperform 3 or 4 different REST queries just because of the length of the trip, the time it needs to process, through authentication, through authorization, through all this stuff. So I think, sometimes people use the performance thing as an excuse rather than a valid point, specifically because of this. So again, you're right, it 100% depends on the use case, but typically GraphQL is going to be grouping multiple APIs under it, or multiple quote unquote REST APIs. So in any case like that, GraphQL should be a clear winner.
Yeah, I want to add to that actually, because I'm glad that you scrolled up to the directives, because I think it's not that we don't see some of the shortcomings of GraphQL, and the market sees them as well. Obviously, the whole community sees them as well. But to the point that Zaid was making, if you have a large query, obviously, it will take time. But then the community starts thinking about it as well. We see those problems. So this is why, for example, you have the last 2 points here on your table. So defer and stream, those are new things. Those are completely new directives that are kind of trying to make it a little bit easier especially if you're using GraphQL in this BFF pattern, to make it a little bit easier for your front end to load and a little bit faster. So yeah.
Absolutely. That's the thing. It's probably one of the more exciting things that has come out of GraphQL. I think that's next evolution of addressing some of those performance issues, all the loading issues, and the way you would actually architect your solution would fundamentally change. I think the way, if you were to use these properly. But if you look at this graph here, it tells a different story, where there is a significant number of people who have not heard of it and therefore do not know about it, and therefore do not use it at all. So these are clear performance winners. They're going to help you in a way where you don't have blockers to getting back. So the way defer and stream work essentially is that you can have segments of your queries being loaded in a deferred way, which means it would load later on. You can prioritize the loading of certain areas, certain fields first before the others load up, which would mean that you're not blocking your UI, you're not blocking your application based on the response that's coming in. So which is amazing. That sounds really, really great. But at the same time, I think there is that knowledge gap, which might be preventing people from actually understanding and using something like this. But at the same time, I also feel that there might be a deeper issue here, which is this was introduced way back in 2016. The latest update that happened on this in terms of adoption by the GraphQL organization as part of the official spec, that is still pending since 2020, I believe. And that has not progressed. And maybe the reason why people don't know enough about it is because it is not, or even using it is because it is not part of the official spec, and people don't want to go ahead and try something that is not part of the official spec, because maybe that's going to change and it's going to break things. So Agata, obviously you worked a little bit with some of these working groups and working committees. What's your take on just having the speed of adoption to the specification as not being a detriment to progressing where the technology is going? Because like you say, the community is hard at work in solving some of these challenges, but perhaps the working groups need to keep up with that pace in some way.
Yeah, and you know what? I agree. The speed with which some of the working groups are moving maybe is not the fastest, but I don't really see that as a surprise, to be honest, because if you look at the technology landscape and how, for example, new versions of Java are coming out, or new versions of C++, or whatever language out there, or whatever technology out there, it's not that a new specification, a new library becomes available every 6 months. It takes time. There's a lot of practitioners in those working groups. That means that we need to divide our time between being part of the community and actually doing our job that we are contracted to do. So yeah, so I think there's some obstacles there. I actually looking at this specific part of the report, the features, I feel, when I was thinking about it, I was looking at the bubbles first because they are colorful and I like color. Yeah. So looking at the bubbles first, it kind of felt that whoever so the respondents, okay, let's be very specific here. The respondents of this survey are very well familiar with GraphQL schema, and I feel like there is, and I don't think it's only the trend of this survey. I feel like it's the trend. We focus a lot on the schema, and we sort of like glorify the schema because it's, you know, strongly typed, and, you know, this is the way that our users are going to interact with our graph and so on. And we focus a lot about the schema, a lot on the schema. Sometimes maybe forgetting that it goes so much deeper beyond the schema. Schema is really just, you know, just a doorknob, and there's like, you know, a whole house behind the door. So yeah,
I wouldn't even call it a doorknob, right? Because schema is essentially a blueprint, because you know, it's a blueprint. You're supposed to still build the house. The blueprint is not the house, isn't it? You still need to build the house. There's a lot that goes into it. So absolutely, you're completely right with it. And I think with that actually exposes another issue with that I have with the schemas, because I think I'm going to draw your attention to the GraphQL usage segment, and we'll have a look at some of the others, but I'm going to go all the way down where I think it goes the GraphQL strong points, and I think I'm gonna pick out maybe one of this specifically, which is the introspection and self-documenting nature of APIs, which is great. I would say self-documentation is probably still better than no documentation at all, but self-documentation is nowhere close to being adequate at all. So I think that's probably my take on this, and I think this is probably the thing that I disagree with the most over here. And I get the point that it's a strong suit of GraphQL, but once again, like I said, the schema is a blueprint. If you want to make sense of it, you need to still have proper documentation. It does not reduce your your need to do that. So Zaid, quite interested in your opinion on this. When we talk about self-documentation with GraphQL, is that truly the thing, or is that sufficient for you to build out applications, or would you say there is a missing piece that needs to be done through proper documentation?
That's a good question. I think again we have to go back to the different use cases, right? But I think from my experience with GraphQL, the self-documentation feature is absolutely great. It definitely helps that, you know, you can write your comments inside your schema and that actually describes them. But also it's actually very similar to what Swagger or OpenAPI spec can do. So it kind of gives you the same idea as OpenAPI spec, but I think OpenAPI spec will have a little bit more stuff on top. But I think self-documentation is great. It's the way to go. GraphQL offers it out of the box, while with REST APIs, you have to go out and write your APIs in OAS compliant spec. So that's, I think, definitely a winning point, in my opinion, for GraphQL, to be honest.
Fair enough. Rich, any thoughts on that, given I think you've been deep in documentation studies as well in terms of what we've been doing? Your thoughts on, you know, self-documenting nature is sufficient? Like Zaid mentioned, maybe that's really, really great. If you're annotating things appropriately, you've got the right information out there, but is that sufficient?
I wouldn't know enough about the topic, if I'm honest.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I know about the user experience and some insights into the developer experience that I've picked up from these sessions, but yeah, not to the level of this.
No worries at all. Another interesting thing that comes up twice, actually. So as a positive, as a strong point, there is this thing around being able to combine together different API schemas, which I'm assuming is alluding perhaps to federation in this case. I'm taking a guess over here, but it seeit's like being able to combine different different API schemas, also part of the pain points, which is quite an interesting take here, as it's appearing on both sides. So there is definitely, I'm assuming there is a benefit of what GraphQL can bring to the table when it comes to scalability of your schemas and working across different teams. But at the same time, that does pose certain challenges, which maybe GraphQL by itself may not be sufficient to be able to handle it. Maybe it needs the support of external tools, maybe an API gateway that could help, or something that's going to enable that federation mechanism in a much more robust way, perhaps. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on this.
Yeah, so that is something that I've heard on some of these sessions, and the people who have successfully, by the sounds of it, implemented federation, essentially have taken, you know, what I guess you'd call a traditional API management approach and a modern one to essentially hide some of that complexity from the wider development teams in their organization to automate those schema updates. And it sounded like, I wouldn't know the intricacies of it, but they had implemented quite elegant workflows into how, once their schema is live, should things change in the data sources, parts of that, if not all of it, have been quite neatly automated, so that can then be like version controlled, and nothing breaks the graph, and unless the workflow permits it, which I thought for me, sort of with a fresh pair of eyes looking at GraphQL and API management, like how that, I guess what you'd call a more traditional API management lifecycle, as opposed to the underlying like new technology of GraphQL, how that still applies. And I think from a user developer experience, potentially that's something that means that there is a pre-existing mental model of how, like once you get your GraphQL schema written, defined, and all the rules and technologies that underpin it, there is some way that you can still apply, I guess, more traditional approaches to how you then interact with and control and govern the schema or the graph.
Definitely. Yep. Absolutely with you on that. Barring combining different API schemas, some of the usual suspects here, of course: error handling, performance, client-side caching, security, usual suspects when it comes to GraphQL. There's always this little debate in my head, at least when it comes to error handling, because I know this comes up quite a lot, where if there is issues at the schema level, at the data level, the query level, you don't really get the right response because your HTTP is still telling you it's a 200 status okay in a lot of cases. Should that change? Should that, is it okay for us to be continuously, for us to handle the error that is happening at the data layer itself, or should that override the HTTP status in some way to say, if you're not getting back a response appropriately at the data level, then your status is not okay? Thoughts on this, perhaps? Zaid, any thoughts on this?
This is a really, really tricky question here. I am a very big fan of HTTP statuses and following the standard. That is not usually how you can do GraphQL, though, because you can have multiple underlying resources and you can have partial responses and partial errors, and it can get really muddy real quick. So I understand why they did it that way. I am not sure if there is a good solution out there for error handling, unless the whole community agrees that it has to be done this way and this way only. It's going to be very difficult, because I think right now it's mainly been the adopted method is to have an error section under your response, and that will have everything for you. But again, anyone, I think that's, part of that problem is the fact that a lot of people are very familiar with the way REST APIs work, and that's how they just learned the whole stack of technology, how requests and APIs communicate and all that. They think, oh, you have your HTTP response, and this is the holy grail. This is the one source of truth for you. And then you give them GraphQL and you get 200 back, but you have errors, and people are just super confused. This is difficult when you have, client applications that use both GraphQL APIs and REST APIs, because the development teams have to figure out, okay, this is a GraphQL API, I have to handle it one way, and then this is a REST API or a SOAP API, and I have to handle it a different way. I think maybe one solution could be to have an abstraction layer on the client, on some of the client tooling that can abstract those APIs and can do some translations maybe, but there's no real good solution right now.
And I see that as the challenge, of course, is when, if you look at organizations trying to handle different API styles. And I think the attempt or the desire is very strong to actually try to have standard tooling across all different API styles and have those standard patterns being applicable, because it reduces complexity, right? Because you don't have to remember or learn 3 different things or maintain 3 different things in 3 different ways. You can very easily have all of that honed in to, a single thing which is standardized, and it's going to work every single time that you're going to be doing.
And it becomes more expensive too. For the people building those applications, if you need a GraphQL person, a REST person, or like a whole team for one, a whole team for the other, you might not even have enough work for a whole team on some of these APIs. So you have to start making some of these decisions from a business perspective and put the development perspective aside sometimes.
Absolutely. And a bigger part of that is also thinking about the future, because there is going to be changes. Your requirements are going to change. You need to have some degree of flexibility, and maybe thinking out about when you're selecting technologies, or when you're selecting not just GraphQL as a technology, but any technology that's going to be added to your stack. How do you consider that? How do you look into the flexibility of what comes next? How do you keep things a little bit more dynamic, a little more flexible, and therefore you're making yourself a little bit more stable, perhaps, for what's to come in the future, as opposed to having to rip apart solutions all the time and then moving forward from there. So absolutely true over there. Coming back to you, Agata, there is a segment here which speaks about the industry sectors where GraphQL seems to have been adopted and it's being in use at this point. Does any of this surprise you, at least from the top 5 perspectives, perhaps? We've obviously, programming and technology is the winner here. That's perfectly fine. But e-commerce, finance, news, media, consulting services, education, does any of that sort of surprise you? Are there any surprises in those top 5 or 6 of them?
No, actually, I don't think there are any that I was, very surprised at any of them. I would have expected the finance to get a little bit, but that's just my thing. That's my background, and I've worked on projects within those sectors, within those industries. And looking back, I wish we had GraphQL sometimes, but we didn't. I think the thing that kind of maybe not surprised, but seems kind of weird, is that you will have finance quite high on the scale, but then you go down and you see, well, but insurance is actually so low, which insurance actually seems like a very good fit for a graph kind of architecture. So I don't know. Maybe it also depends on the group that was answering. I think maybe just not too many insurance guys out there. But I don't think anything surprised me a lot. Yeah, the first place didn't really surprise me. Yeah.
Fair enough, absolutely, and that's true. I think the thing that always comes to mind for me when I think about things like finance, think about healthcare, perhaps the more regulated industries, whether GraphQL there is a blocker to GraphQL adoption because as a consequence of there being certain standards, compliance requirements, which don't specifically talk about GraphQL. They don't specifically talk about. They tend to lean a little bit towards being REST or RESTful compared to some of the other API styles, perhaps. Or maybe that's no longer a blocker. Maybe there is an evolution of that already happening, or maybe the use cases shifted inwards versus being outwards.
To be honest, I don't know. I don't think I know enough. I can talk to the regulation in the finance and the insurance industries, but not in general about regulation. I think what I kind of see as encouraging is, and over here on this graph, it's a little bit down. There's the government sector. There's not a lot of, that didn't get a high score over here. However, the encouraging part is if you've attended some of the GraphQL conferences throughout the last couple of years, there has been a push and there will be actually governmental institutions who will promote GraphQL as a technology within their own community. I know UK does amazing work with this, and they actually have a full department that is organizing education and is helping different sections of the government adopt GraphQL. I know Asia is doing, in Asia also, a couple of governments are looking towards that. So I think that's the thing that I find encouraging, even though this report doesn't seem to say like, because I'm thinking, if you have the state, the government looking into a technology, it just shows that, yeah, even though maybe there are some regulatory challenges, like GDPR probably in government is the biggest one, it's still being promoted, so it can't be that bad.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that might also speak to the maturity of where we've come to with GraphQL. And I think that's why it's getting that adoption. I think me being part of Singapore previously, I think cloud adoption was a big challenge, because cloud, we take it for granted today with the AWSs and the Azures of the world. But for a long time there, in the government space, AWS was not really a thing in Singapore. And there was a long period where there was a transition that was happening. So it took a little bit of time, and I think it speaks to that maturity. And I'm happy to see GraphQL getting there with some of the toolings and community support. One last thing before we close this out, I think, was around the libraries, which got me very interested, because there are ways in which, as a developer, you'll be building out your solutions, right? You've got your servers, you've got your clients, your API generators, schema builders, but there are two stats to look at here across all of these, which is there is the usage percentage, which gives you a few different winners. You've got Apollo Server, of course, it's been around for a very long time. It tends to be the go-to for a lot of folks to build your GraphQL servers, with GraphQL JS, Express.js coming in after, with Yoga and Absinthe 4 and 5. But if you look at the retention percentage, the thing goes completely different. Your top 3 winners are quite different from your winners when it comes to usages, so retention essentially is how many people are coming back and building out more servers and using it across multiple use cases. So DGS and Absinthe, probably newer kids on the block at this point, are doing a little bit better, or working a little bit better with the developer community, perhaps for their usage. I have not managed to use it yet, but I would imagine it's coming from a place of better usability or better tooling than Apollo potentially having a couple of challenges that are yet to be solved, perhaps. And these guys are doing a little bit of a better job. So very interesting. When you look at this report, always look at the usage percentage and the retention percentage to give you a good picture of where we are. So we're almost out of time here. We are at the hour. So last question, perhaps as a closing thing for us, maybe. One thing that you might want to, so if you were to have like a state of GraphQL 2023, what would you like to see next December from GraphQL? It could be business, it could be developer, maybe from a technology itself, or it could be something more from the usage area. We'll start with you, Agatha, perhaps, in terms of what you like to see in state of GraphQL 2023.
We're going alphabetically, I see. Okay. Yeah, it's always the first one.
There's only going to be one winner if you go alphabetically in this one.
Yeah, unless we go with the last names, then I'm the last. So for 2023, I think, what would I like to see with the state of GraphQL? I would love to see the users, because it's the users who are replying to this survey. Users or people who have a vested interest in taking a survey like this. I would love to see interest maybe a little bit beyond just a schema. Interest in some really powerful features, some really powerful directives, for example, that GraphQL offers out of the box. I think, yeah, well, I wouldn't say new, because they've been in the works for a couple of years. I'm talking about defer and stream. Maybe a little bit more people. I think, bottom line for me is I would love to see the respondents looking a little bit beyond the schema, just the schema. Looking at out-of-the-box functionalities that GraphQL already today offers, that can solve a lot of the problems that people are moaning about, on the internet. Although the internet is people will be moaning there anyway, but you know what I mean.
Fair enough. Got you. Zaid, over to you. We are breaking the cycle. Over to you, Zaid.
I think the biggest thing for me is standardizing, having the community agree on some of the issues that we have, figure out how we want to solve them, and actually go ahead with it. I think one of the problems that we have, as we mentioned, is we have a lot of different directives like defer and stream, and it's been in the works since 2016, right? We need to be, we need to show more interest as a community to drive the technology forward. Unless maybe some of these issues that we have been complaining about are not that big of issues. Maybe we've been saying performance is horrible, but nobody actually cares their performance. Okay, maybe then there's no problem at that point, right? So,
based on this report, it seems like they do. So,
yeah,
people do care about it.
Well, also that's also only 3,000 engineers, you said, right? So I'm sure there's. I'm not saying it's skewed, obviously, True. But there's definitely more information out there, I believe. From what I have seen from my experience talking to different prospects, there's more to it than what we saw in the report, I think.
Agreed, absolutely. And just to be clear, I think from the different directives you're speaking of, defer and stream, there are flavors of that out there. With, I think Hazura has a flavor of it, Apollo has a flavor of it, but the official standard isn't available at this point. And that might be, again, preventing folks, at least like Zaid mentioned, maybe it's preventing these 3,000 folks, maybe not the remaining millions of developers out there, perhaps. But we'll probably wait for the next state of report for that.
Exactly. And one last thing that you just mentioned, a lot of different tools and companies have different flavors of certain things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We have a spec for a reason. I think we should all be respecting
it. I completely agree with you on that. Any closing thoughts there, Richard, in terms of whatever you've seen so far and today's discussion?
I think from a tooling or product perspective, what I'd love to see is a platform out there, nudge nudge wink wink, that that really provides a shit hot user developer experience for the specific use cases where GraphQL offers really good value. So whether it's orchestration or backend for front end, something that provides breaks down the learning curve and also clearly demonstrates the business value with a clear sort of value proposition and user experience that says, here's why you should use GraphQL and here's how we've made it easy. I think that would then go a long way to solving the learnability issues that we see and the this endless debate of GraphQL versus REST array and other, and say, okay, this is what GraphQL is good at. We've made it easy to use. There you go. Get on with it.
Yeah.
Absolutely, 100% agree with you. For me, I think it's going to be around. There are a couple of segments to this, but I think the key segment there is standardization. Like Zaid, you mentioned, I'm really keen on seeing the defer, the stream, those directives coming in. There's also live queries versus streaming, especially for subscription. I think live query could be a really, really powerful way of handling streams, because you're looking at changes in data as opposed to events specifically, which could be quite powerful. Again, not part of the official spec. So really looking forward to having those kind of performance gains, having those kind of visibility and real-time data out there. I'm also looking at perhaps specific use cases coming up. I think more driven by the pain points that GraphQL is solving, and I would want more conversation and discussions around those. Like Richard, you mentioned, exactly what is it that we're trying to solve and whether GraphQL is the right solution for it. And if it is, then let's put it out there and say, this is where GraphQL stands firm, and make it the winner. Let it be the winner. Don't pull it back when you don't need to. And ultimately, with GraphQL being almost invisible to the overall stack, because I mean, the technology should never be the most visible thing when you're building out a product. So that would be my key takeaways over here. So with that, hopefully we will see you again at the next edition of the GraphQL Hangout, which I believe at this point is going to be next year. So thank you everyone for joining. This has been a fantastic session. Thank you all of the panelists, Agata, Zaid, Richard. It's been amazing. It's been incredible. 50 segments that we've had, 50 episodes, and I'm looking forward to the next 50 as well. So thank you everyone. Thank you for joining.